Wildlands Chesapeake Bay is deeply rooted in natives, serving Charles, Calvert, St. Mary's, Anne Arundel, and Prince George's County. And before we begin our presentation with Kirsten and Judy, I'd like to introduce you to Wild Ones. Wild Ones is a national 501c3 charitable organization based in Wisconsin that works to connect people and native plants for a healthy planet. There are currently 96 chapters and 37 seedlings across the United States. If you're not a Wild Ones member, I encourage you to join your local chapter. And in Maryland, we have 5 chapters. Wild Ones Chesapeake Bay serving Southern Maryland, the Delmarva Seedling on the Eastern Shore, Greater Baltimore, Greater Frederick, and the nation's capital region. Wild Ones Chesapeake Bay currently has 79 members, which includes 3 businesses and 2 nonprofits. And you can see from the coloration on the map where our members are concentrated. The mission of Wild Ones is to promote native landscapes through education, advocacy, and collaborative action. Our vision is native plants and natural landscapes thriving in every community, connecting people and native plants for a healthy planet. We inspire change through shared core values. Respect is at the heart of Wild Ones. We have respect for each other, for nature, and for the earth. We're an inclusive community. Diverse voices and backgrounds make us stronger. That's why we welcome everyone to join us. We provide evidence-based information because the seeds of change spread most efficiently when grounded in data. We monitor and share the latest evidence-informed strategies. We're action and growth oriented. Just dig in. We learn, grow, and share our knowledge. With us tonight to discuss a legislative approach to promote and protect native plants are Kirsten Hoffman and Judy Fulton. I think you'll agree with me that their bios read like a who's who of Maryland native and invasive plant experts. Kirsten Hoffman is one of the founding members of the Maryland Native Plant Coalition, which has written and passed 2 important pieces of state legislation: the 2023 bill that created the Maryland Native Plants Program, and the 2024 bill that strengthened Maryland's invasive plant laws. Kirsten is a member of the executive board of the Green Towson Alliance and heads up their legislative affairs work group, supporting efforts to improve Baltimore County's environmental sustainability. She's the treasurer for the Maryland Native Plant Society and recently became a Maryland Master Naturalist, working on a habitat restoration project at the Cylburn Arboretum. For the past 3 years, she has been a Blue Water Baltimore tree steward for her neighborhood and has helped residents select and plant over 100 native trees. Kirsten is a registered architect in the state of Maryland and performs flute and piccolo with Flutopia Baltimore. Very impressive, Kirsten.
Thank you.
And then there's Judy Fulton. She's the founder of Echo Plant Consulting. She believes healthy ecosystems are crucial for human survival. Judy transforms places overrun by invasives into native landscapes, shares her knowledge via workshops and field trips, and serves as an expert in invasive plant litigation. Judy is vice president of the Maryland Native Plant Society and a member of the Maryland Invasive Species Council and the board of the Mid-Atlantic Invasive Plant Council. She earned a Harvard MBA and 3 Maryland's Top 100 Women Awards from the Daily Record. During recent Maryland legislative sessions, she was pleased to help write and pass the 2023 Maryland Native Plants Program and the 2024 Maryland Invasive Plant Bill. For consulting, for co-authoring Plant Invaders of the Mid-Atlantic Natural Areas Field Guide, and her lead role in creating the Maryland Atlantic Invaders Tool, an online guide to more than 900 invasive species, have positioned Judy as a sought-after advisor in eco-restoration. So before I turn this over to Kirsten and Judy, I just want to mention that I'll be putting links in the chat throughout the presentation. And I will also include a link to our post-event survey where we encourage you to enter feedback from tonight's event. We use that to improve our programs and to also let our speakers know what things of interest are out there for the individuals who attended. So with that, I will stop my share and I will turn it over to Judy and Kirsten. Take it away, ladies.
Well, first, thank you, Marlene, for inviting Judy and I to address Wild Ones tonight. I am a member of my Wild Ones local chapter here, and I certainly appreciate your mission and enjoy attending Wild Ones events and have met lots of great people that way. So, as Marlene mentioned, Judy and I have worked together the last several years on legislation on native and invasive plants. And through that process, we have created the group, the Maryland Native Plant Coalition. We were both founding members, along with Marie Laporte of the Sierra Club. And we all came together working on this legislation because we each brought something different to the table that made this process successful, remarkably successful for us being new people at it. So the coalition has continued to work together on various things, and we will share with you tonight our work over the last few years. So tonight we're going to first spend some time on native plant legislation. We mentioned our 2023 bill that created the Maryland Native Plants Program. We will spend most of the time on that, but give you a little introduction to previous bills from 2022 and 2021 that did have some effect on promoting native plants. Then we will switch gears and talk about invasive plant legislation. Again, spending the majority of our time on the 2024 bill that we helped to write and pass. But this bill built on previous bills. So you really need to understand how the Maryland laws came about by legislation in 2022 and 2011. So we'll give you a little background on that just to help you understand the full picture there. Then we'll shift and talk a little bit about some county efforts we've been involved in and close with a very short recap of the 2025 Maryland General Assembly session that just finished. So I'd like to start with what I call our origin story. And this is kind of our introduction to getting into legislation. This was kind of the summer of 2022, and I was new to working with native plants. I'd heard talks and things about how important they were, and really wanted to add native plants to my landscape, but I knew very little. So I was researching, trying to find native plants, trying to find native plant nurseries, and found it challenging. As I went to some nurseries I'd been going to, I started seeing plant tags that said native, but I didn't really know if that meant native to Maryland, native to some other part of the US. It really wasn't clear. And many of the nurseries had plants with very pretty tags and pots and little names after them, which I didn't realize at the time were cultivars, and I didn't know what that distinction was either. So I felt like there was information that I needed, and if I needed it, I had to imagine that many other consumers were looking for that too. About this time, someone came to our Green Towson Alliance meeting and said, hey, New Jersey has just passed a bill. We were calling it the labeling bill, because they were going to label New Jersey native plants at nurseries as Jersey natives to help New Jerseyans find native plants more easily. This was going to be run through the Department of Agriculture, and they had an education component, and it was a short bill, but as we went through it, we thought this would be an amazing bill to have in the state of Maryland. So we set about doing some research to see if this was something that we could do and we could bring to Maryland. I got a little way into it and I realized I needed an expert, and that is when I reached out to Judy to help with being the native plant expert on the project.
Part of the bill that we decided to start with was the definition of native plant. There wasn't one yet. And so we used one of two that are very often used. Specifically, we used native plant, means a plant that occurs naturally in the state and surrounding region, ecosystem, and habitat. without direct or indirect human actions. A native plant includes, first of all, plants that were present before colonial settlement. Now, a native plant can take millennia to evolve, but this is just an easy point in time to use. And in particular, indigenous people did obviously were involved with native plants beforehand. They didn't just start up when we came over, starting with the Europeans. In addition, we decided that we needed to have a source to use to determine whether a plant was native in Maryland. So that source is the Maryland Plant Atlas. You're probably aware, but you can look through all sorts of lists and they all have a different set of plants. So this is important to use this particular list because it is accepted by scientists throughout Maryland and outside of Maryland. And also it is basically the Bible that the Maryland Department of Natural Resources uses. The Maryland Plant Atlas, and you can see the link here, it's already been put in the chat, is what we use for determining whether a species is native. The atlas includes all species, all plant species that are in natural areas. That means it includes both natives and naturalized non-natives. You can tell the difference between the two because if it's non-native, when you look up the species in the Maryland Plant Atlas, it will say non-native or some other indication that it is not currently a Maryland native. For instance, it might be a historic plant that's no longer seen in Maryland. You'll find that in the Maryland Plant Atlas. If it doesn't have any kind of label, then it's native. So by default, it's native, and otherwise it's labeled. We also liked about this database that it was searchable and that it was kept current, that when there are new species that are identified in the state, then they're included in this application. The basis for this was a PDF that was produced in 2021, a scientific publication called Vascular Plants of Maryland. That is also available through the Maryland Department of Natural Resources, their website. But the issue with the PDF is, first of all, it's not easily searchable. And second of all, it's static. It was written in 2021, and unless there's an update written, it's never going to be revised. So again, we chose this database. Then we had to decide what we wanted to have in the bill, what the main components were going to be. Number one, we wanted a list that people could use that really was practical. I think a lot of people are aware of the booklet called, it's the Chesapeake Bay booklet. And that is at this point really outdated. It doesn't have all the plants that we might want to put in our gardens. Certainly doesn't have all the plants that are native throughout Maryland. So what we decided was that we would develop a commercial Maryland native plant list. In this bill, it would be specified, and that would come from crossing basically the Maryland Plant Atlas with what nurseries sell, so that instead of having 4,000 or so different species, most of which we couldn't get hold of and couldn't grow if we could get hold of. We wanted to be practical about this and have a tool that anyone from your beginner gardener to your wild ones member to your nursery or scientists could refer to. Number two, we decided it would make sense to include a voluntary nursery certification program like the New Jersey bill. It would be administered by the Maryland Department of Ag, and within the Department of Ag, there's an area that does marketing, and it's called Maryland's Best. So it would be within the Maryland's Best program. Nurseries who sell native plants can apply to be certified, and we'll go into more detail on that later on. Another key component of the bill was we decided we really needed to have a specialist in Maryland Extension who would focus on native plants and in particular would focus on implementing this bill.
So we're going to go into each of those three in a little more detail. First, on the commercial Maryland native plant list, Judy mentioned a little bit about the big focus of it. Just at some background, as part of developing this legislation, I wanted to learn more about native plants and what native plants were available. So during that process, I gathered up recommended plant list, inventories from nurseries, and started putting them together in a long list. And that background research ended up evolving eventually into the commercial Maryland native plant list after we put basically the last year's amount of work into it. So we've put a lot of time into it, but we started with what was out there in the trade and accumulating what was out there in the trade. We then cross-referenced with the Maryland Plant Atlas to make sure all of these plants were native by the source that we designated to determine nativity. And they're found at nurseries not just in Maryland, because we have neighboring states very close by that many people use to get their Maryland native plants. So we looked at some of the nurseries in Pennsylvania and in DC and Delaware, so we'd have nearby nurseries as well. The list is for straight species natives. We'll talk a little bit later about the provision of how we dealt with cultivars in the legislation, but the idea of the legislation was to promote straight species natives. Cultivars already have fancy names and marketing that go with them, but straight species natives do not. So that's what we've got on the list right now, and there may be a few exceptions for cultivars, but for the most part, it's going to be straight species natives. Once we put all these species together in inventories, we came up with about 600 plants. So this is a very detailed list, really with something for everybody out there. Lots and lots of plants, and we're continually updating it. As we've been getting nurseries submit their information to be included in the certification program, we have gone through their inventories and we keep finding plants that are native and are not on our list. So once we have our implementation committee looks at each plant and discusses, and if it seems like it is a good fit, we add it to the list. So the list has been growing, which is great. Lots of information there. So I believe this link to the extension website where you can find the list will be put in the chat. So please go and take a look. I'm going to give you a brief tour next. So right now the list is housed at a website through the University of Maryland Extension. It can also be found through the Maryland Department of Agriculture's website through the Maryland's Best program. I typically refer people to the extension website. It's a little easier to find, I think. So the list, I just wanted to show you what information is here because we had a nice committee that spent a lot of time really trying to make this a document with lots of information for all different kinds of consumers, from beginners to advanced, as well as for industry, so that everybody could get something out of this list. The list is organized alphabetically, either alphabetically by plant type or just plain alphabetically. And there's tabs at the bottom here that show you those two. Right now, the list is, it defaults to alphabetical by plant type. There are also tabs if you only want to see wildflowers, ferns, etc., that you can isolate and just see that one plant type. So in addition to plant type, which starts with, we wanted to make sure that the region information, the level 2 ecoregion, was available here. So that would be if the plant was in the mountain, Piedmont, or coastal plain. And one really nice thing is if there's a capital letter under the region category, it is common in that region. And if it's a lowercase letter, it's uncommon in that region. So it just gives you that little bit of extra information. Then we have the typical columns. I'll kind of scroll across here. Light, moisture, soil types. Growth it's in development now. I'm going to talk about that in the next slide. Dimensions at maturity, as well as flower colors and bloom times, fruit or any other distinguishing characteristics. Fall foliage, which you can see it's blank up here, but if you scroll down to the tree section, you'll see all the fall foliage filled in, or any winter interest. Really nice to have information on wildlife value, so you can see what your plants are benefiting, as well as things that your plants will tolerate. Do they tolerate drought? Do they tolerate salt? So those, super helpful. That there's a lot of information. The last column on here, just briefly, is a synonym column. As we've been going through plant inventories at nurseries, we find that very often, actually, a nursery might be using an older name for the plant. So if you're at a nursery and you're trying to say, hey, this plant has a native tag, is this a Maryland native? And you want to look up here. If you don't find it, make sure you check the selected synonyms column, because it may be in there. And then you can see what the current plant name is, going back to the scientific name. The one other thing I wanted to show you on here is one of our other tabs, which is our sources tab. And this is all the different sources we used to put this document together. And I wanted to highlight at the bottom here the Virginia plant guides, which were super helpful. And we like these guides so much that we'll talk about this in a bit, but we're in process of trying to create something very similar for Maryland. So that is the list. I hope you all take a look at it and use it, and please feel free to write any of us with feedback you have or questions you have about the list. So remember I mentioned that growth column. This is something that I've not seen on a plant list before, but it was something we wanted to include. And this is in progress, so we're working on this right now and doing the research required to add this column. And what this gets at is something called a C value, which is the coefficient of conservation. And this is putting a numerical value on plants' behavior. How does the plant behave in its natural setting? And though that is what it is in the natural setting, we believe that this is useful information for a gardener as well, that the plant's going to behave somewhat similarly in a garden setting. The plants are rated from 1 to 10, and we've kind of divided them into 3 categories, grouping the numbers. And the plants are rated on 3 different characteristics. First, it's ecological tolerance. That is getting at how many habitats will that plant grow in? Does it pretty much grow anywhere that you plop the seeds down? Or is it very picky? And it's got very, very specific conditions it grows in. How many plant communities does it grow in? Again, does it grow in a lot of different communities with a lot of different plants? Or is it very specific who it wants as its neighbors? And finally, it looks at its disturbance tolerance. Will it work in a highly disturbed site, something that has either been burned or graded, or does it need very, very stable conditions? And by looking at those 3 categories, the plant is assigned a C value, and if it's a low value in that 1 to 3 range, These are plants that on the positive side, they're easy to grow, they're flexible. On the negative side, they might be a little aggressive. And you might want to be careful of these if you have a small space or in a home garden that plant can't spread, because these are what we might think of as our spreaders. On the other end, the 8, 9, 10 categories, these plants can be challenging to grow, and they might be frustrating for many gardeners because they need specific conditions. And so on the Maryland native plant list, what we are gearing toward are those plants that fall in the middle, that 4 through 7 range, that we think those are going to be the best plants, and the plants that are people buying plants and putting them in their landscapes are going to have the most success with. Maryland has not given a C value to all of its native plants. Virginia has and Delaware has. So we are looking at the information from those 2 states and filling in gaps as we need to. So that's why it is a work in progress, but definitely stay tuned, and hopefully in the next few months, we will actually have this information available for you on the commercial Maryland native plant list.
And I can add also in terms of the C values, though I think most gardeners would prefer to stay in the middle, if they've got a situation where they're really fighting with invasives, then they might choose to have the C values of 1, 2, or 3 to put in those plants, because those might be ideal for those conditions and what the gardener or landscaper wants to accomplish. So we've been trying to add as many species as we think makes sense, as long as they are native to Maryland and they are commercial. But in the process, we have decided to exclude certain types of plants. One screen we use is if a plant is rare, endangered, or threatened, we won't include them on the list unless they're already widely sold. And the reason is that if gardeners plant one of these plants and there's a natural area nearby, and they cross-pollinate, chances are the plant that has been purchased comes from different growing conditions, maybe out several states away, maybe in the prairie. We do have plenty of prairie plants here, for instance. And if the plants cross-pollinate from the garden to the natural areas, it can actually damage the genetics of the plants that have evolved to grow in the conditions here in Maryland. This plant here, this sundial lupin, is a good example. This is a state rare plant that is threatened. Another issue, and I'm going to jump down 2 bullets there, is if a plant can be confused with non-natives or might hybridize with an invasive. And again, the lupin here is regularly confused with non-natives. And I can speak from experience because I purchased a number of years ago plants labeled as our native Lupinus perennis. I got them in early March, I believe, and all that I could see was a pot with a living plant in it, but it was still asleep for the winter, so I couldn't really tell much about it. And I planted all these so-called sundial lupins, and it was only after they started blooming that I realized they were actually a completely different species, that the nursery had grown from seed and had acquired the seed and been told the wrong species. The plant I was growing was a West Coast lupin that actually had been showing invasive tendencies here in Maryland and certainly further north. So here I had, I think, about 15 beautiful plants, and I had to pull them up. So we didn't want that to happen to people looking at the list and going to a nursery and buying a species. I chose one that I think is absolutely gorgeous here. So what's not to love? So someone trying to get this plant would be in danger of actually getting a possibly invasive different species. That's why we decided to exclude the rare, endangered, and threatened plants. And we also decided to exclude plants that used to be growing here in Maryland, but were no longer present. And I have a very interesting spelling for Maryland there, I see. So historically, they've been here, or they're probably extirpated, which means they're gone. I mentioned already the confusion with non-natives, but another thing that we wanted to avoid was hybridizing with invasives. And there's certain species that are more likely to hybridize with others. Let's take, for instance, the white mulberry is invasive and the red mulberry is native, and you almost never see a straight species native in certainly in the Baltimore, Washington area because they've hybridized so widely. If a plant is really difficult to cultivate, we've left them off the list. Examples would be, for instance, grape fern, dissected grape fern, which is a lovely fern, small, tends to grow in rocky areas, but it is completely dependent on beneficial microbes in the soil. It cannot grow without specific species of mycorrhizae. It's so dependent that it might not even send up a frond for a number of years because it's living off the microbes in the soil. And that just did not make any sense to include on the commercial list. We excluded dangerous plants. By that, there are, for instance, plants that have sap that if they get on you, if the sap gets on you, you are more susceptible to sunburn. People might be aware of the invasive giant hogweed. There are plants that are closely related to that or might have huge spines on them. We excluded those. And we excluded all cultivars and hybrids that are created by or propagated specifically by cloning by nurseries, with one exception. And this was a late amendment we put into the bill to get the support of nurseries so that it could be passed. And that is, if there is a species that isn't viable anymore in the wild because it's been attacked by invasive insects or diseases, that's the one exception to this rule of no cultivars or designed hybrids. And I'm going to now go into more detail about that. This is really a hot issue for the nursery because a lot of nurseries make a lot of money on selling hybrids or cultivars. And these named cultivars or hybrids, they're usually identified by a name that is in single quotes. Sometimes the nurseries leave the single quotes off, but it might be, for instance, purple knockout. That's the name of a cultivar. Or in fact of the native lyre-leaf sage, or Jacob Klein Monarda. So you as gardeners probably know what the naming convention is for the cultivars. Sometimes people are confused because cultivars are called nativars if they're cultivars of native plants, but those basically, those are synonyms. The idea, as Kirsten mentioned, was the bill is meant to promote straight species. The cultivars get marketing support, but the native species traditionally have gotten very little marketing behind them. And cultivars can damage straight species. I already mentioned if a plant is rare, threatened, or endangered, there can be issues. But frankly, there can be issues with any plant where there aren't huge populations in the wild. Something like red maple might not make a difference if you plant a cultivar. But a lot of our native plants, you can affect the genetics. And our natives have extremely varied genetics, and that helps them survive, especially in these days of climate change. If you've got a big variety of different genetics, then maybe one particular specimen might not survive, but somewhere there's probably a straight species with different genetics that is going to survive. Cultivars, on the other hand, are usually identical twins that are propagated by cloning. Sometimes the seed is true to the cultivar, but there it's still very little genetic variation. It's like fraternal twins, for instance. So we did include the compromise language that I mentioned on the previous slide of when disease or invasive insects might make the straight species non-viable. And I'm talking about here, Kirsten and I joked that it was the American Elm Amendment because of the problems with our native elms surviving in the wild because they are under attack from Dutch elm disease. We've mentioned the list. We've also touched on the certification program. What we emphasized, and one of the reasons we could get this bill passed, is this is a voluntary program for native plant sellers and growers. It's an opportunity for them to get marketing assistance. And it is based on how the nurseries line up with the commercial Maryland native plant list, which, as we mentioned, lines up with the Maryland Plant Atlas. So we do a simple calculation. We discussed all sorts of different alternatives and decided that it should be based on the number of plants on the commercial Maryland native plant list as a percent of the total plants in inventory. And I say total plants, but that doesn't include plants like houseplants or herbs or vegetable garden plants. We're talking about the ornamentals here. There are 3 certification levels, and the idea of having 3 levels is to acknowledge what a good job certain nurseries are doing, and also encourage nurseries that are just starting to sell straight species natives to get into the business more seriously and grow their percentage of straight species. So gold certifications mean that a nursery has 75% or more of straight species natives. Silver means 50 to 74%, and bronze, those are the starter nurseries who have anywhere from 20 to 49% of the straight species natives. And again, as part of the Maryland's Best certification program, there are marketing materials that are being developed both by the Department of Ag and by the Maryland Extension. This here is the logo that was developed by Amanda Ray. I see that she is on this call. This is a beautiful logo for the Maryland Department of Ag. And the constraint was that it needed to fit in with the other existing logos that are really quite old-fashioned, but at the same time offer a breath of fresh air. So I personally love this logo. Excuse me. So the certification program is on Maryland's Best program consumer page. The link is here at the bottom, and it would be great if that would be put in the chat too. There is a list of certified growers and retailers, and it includes both the certification and the number of plants that the nursery sells, the total number of species, and the percent that we were just talking about of their plants that are Maryland native species. And the reason that we have all this information is that maybe someone wants to go to a nursery that might have all sorts of different plants, not necessarily native, but they might have a very large number of straight species Maryland native plants. So that's why we've included that. Or they might rather go to a nursery that has a high percentage of straight species Maryland plants, but might have fewer plants. Or maybe they want both a high number and a high percentage. We just recently opened this up for applications, and at the moment there are 20 nurseries from, I believe it's 10 counties that have applied to be certified and that we have checked out to make sure that their inventory does match up with what we're looking for.
So the last piece of our bill that created the Maryland Native Plants Program was providing a position at the University of Maryland Extension for a native plant specialist. And this was a position that they'd had in the past and lost funding for. And at the time we were developing the bill, the extension was seeing a ever-growing demand for information on native plants. They received lots of phone calls that they were tracking. And it turns out their webpage that was called Recommended Native Plants for Maryland was their most visited webpage, I believe, in 2022. So it was a position they really needed, and we were so happy that we could actually include this in the legislation and get funding for it, because that is always the most difficult part when you pass a bill, is to have a bill that has any funding associated with it. So this person, who is Lisa Cooter, who was hired in the fall, I'm sure many of you have met her. She is doing a fantastic job. And her main goals are education and research in native plants. And I just wanted to mention some projects that are coming up, because these first months that she's been there have been developing the commercial native plant list and getting that live, and getting the certification program up and running. Now that both of those things are available, we'll continue to work on them, but she can turn her attention somewhat, and some new projects that are coming. I mentioned the regional plant guides. We are working on those for each of our 3 ecoregions, similar to the Virginia guides, beautiful full color guides with many, many plant species. That's under debate right now, whether it'll be, how many 100 plant species will be in there, but there'll be great guides for everyone across the state. And we are really excited. The Piedmont guide is coming first. That is the one that we're currently working on. Next, she's working on establishing a native seed program in Maryland. And this has been something that has been talked about that restricts the growth of the native nurseries, is because they really need access to local ecotype seeds. And we were approached by Marsby, the Mid-Atlantic Regional Seed Bank, who's working across several states, and they wanted to help in Maryland and start this effort. And they've been putting together a list of native species that would be great to get people involved in growing them in seed plots and establishing a seed industry. So once that is approved, and we'll be looking for entrepreneurs who want to get into this business, and hoping that there are some people interested in starting to grow seeds for Maryland nurseries. And finally, we showed you the commercial Maryland native plant list, which is currently a spreadsheet. We are working with a student group at the University of Maryland College Park to develop a searchable database. That is going to be ongoing for a couple of semesters with the students, but hopefully within the year, there will be a searchable database for the commercial list, which will be a really nice resource for everyone. I briefly wanted to mention a couple of things that were not included in the 2023 legislation. First was the designation of a native plant month. We talked about this, but I now realize it would have sent the bill to another committee, and it just got complicated. So we were asked by our sponsor to remove this. We really thought we were going to have a native plant month designated this year. The 2025 session had HB 368 that was asking to designate May as Maryland Native Plant Month. It was end of the session, and this one didn't make it over the finish line, but the group that put that bill together is going to bring it next year. So everybody hope and watch for that, and be ready to advocate to get that bill over the finish line in 2026. The second issue that we wish we would have had in the bill but weren't able to at the time dealt with pesticides. We really wanted to make sure that if someone's buying a native plant to help pollinators, that they weren't going to end up harming pollinators. And that has been an issue that has been documented. And we really just wanted some mention of IPM, integrative pest management, that nurseries needed to follow IPM practices when growing Maryland native plants. But the pesticide lobby is a national lobby and incredibly powerful. And our sponsor said, we cannot have any mention of pesticides or this bill will be dead on arrival. So unfortunately, we had to take that out. Instead, we've taken a more educational approach, and we have been working with the Xerxes Society as they work with growers to supply plants for their projects. And they have been developing a contract for that has a list of pesticides, one, that are systemic, that cannot be used at all. And then two, there are some pesticides that can only be used 2 weeks before sale. So they are putting together some documentation on that we are eventually going to have that loaded on our websites. So that will be available. And as consumers, it is worth looking through. And when you go to nurseries, it's worth asking what practices that nursery is doing, because your feedback will help them engage in the best practices. And briefly, a few other Maryland laws that dealt with native plants. In 2022, the Invasive and Native Plants Bill was mainly thought of as an invasive bill, but it did have one line that dealt with native plants. And that was requiring state agencies to prioritize use of native plants whenever possible. It is pretty not really strict language, and I will say anecdotally, when we have been to Annapolis and seen the planting beds around the State House and government buildings, we don't see a whole lot of straight species natives going in those beds. So there is definitely work to be done and education to be done at the state level to really stress that this was part of legislation in 2022, and we would really like to see this start happening. A second bill, which you might all be familiar with, was passed in 2021. It's known as the HOA law. And this came about from a homeowner who had put native plants in beds in her front yard and had a neighbor complain that she should only have turf grass. And after many lawyers and back and forth, this ended up as a bill with the legislature that passed and said that HOAs cannot require turf grass, and they cannot put unreasonable restrictions on low impact landscaping. And then it defined low impact landscaping broadly as landscaping that benefits pollinators, wildlife, and it includes rain gardens and xeriscaping. So that's been another law that has kind of laid a foundation that we're very happy to see on the books. I know we have spent a lot of time on the native plant legislation, and partly because it has been implemented, and it's really wonderful to see the bill all come together. So I think we'll have to move a little bit more quickly through the invasive plant legislation. I know Judy and I could talk about it all night, but we won't do that for you. So just a brief background. Invasive plants were first regulated through noxious weed laws, and they date back to the late 1800s. I believe the first was in Washington State. And noxious weeds were plants that were harmful mainly to agricultural crops. And noxious weed laws often required landowners to eradicate or control that species, versus invasive plant laws, which we are now seeing, after the year 2000 or so, which don't usually have a control or eradication feature. They mainly just concentrate on removing a plant from sale. So in 1999, there was a federal executive order that defined invasive species. This was broad, but this definition later was used in Maryland law, and it kind of picks up three features. It's an alien species whose introduction does or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. And you'll see that theme has reoccurred in most states' laws now. Maryland passed its first invasive plant law in 2011, and that established the system that they regulated invasive plants, with amendments in 2022. And other states, at the same time Maryland was starting to regulate invasive plants, were doing the same. New York's law has a lot of similarities from 2014, Delaware's as well. New Jersey passed a law last year and the governor vetoed it. So I see it's at the legislature again this year. So we're hoping New Jersey will get their law passed. And at this point, the majority of states, all but a few in the United States, either have an invasive plant law or a noxious weed law. So this is something that most states are doing. Our 2011 law did four main things, and this kind of set the basis for our regulation of invasive plant species. First, the regulating agency is the Department of Agriculture, and they defined invasive plant species as commercial and terrestrial plants only. So this law did not regulate aquatic species, and it did not regulate non-commercial species or species that are not sold by the nursery trade. So they were really only interested if a species was in the nursery trade that they would regulate that. The 2011 law adopted a scientific risk assessment protocol. Risk assessment stressing plants that are new to the environment, they have just moved in, often known as EDRR species, early detection rapid response species. So it was meant to mainly assess if this species was going to become highly invasive. It really wasn't designed to address species that were already rampant across the state and very well established. The law created a two-tier system. You might have heard Tier 1 and Tier 2. Tier 1 plants were prohibited from sale and propagation. Tier 2 plants were still able to be sold. They just required a warning sign at point of sale. And to determine that, all plants went through the risk assessment, and then plants went through a second assessment called the Maryland Screen. And the Maryland Screen looked at how long has a plant been in the state? How widely established is it? And does it harm threatened and endangered species? And if it was in the state more than 50 years and well established and wasn't harming threatened and endangered species, it got placed on tier 2. So even though it was highly invasive, it was still okay to be sold. And finally, the law established the Invasive Species Advisory Council, better known as IPAC, which was tasked with implementing the law, writing the regulations that the Department of Ag would use to regulate invasive species. So after about 10 years of the law, so let's jump ahead to 2020 or so, there were 6 species who had been assessed as highly invasive and placed on tier 1. These are the 6 species. So these were the 6 species that were removed and nurseries could no longer sell after a phase out period. So this is where we still stand today with these 6 species that are prohibited from sale and propagation. The law also placed 13 species on tier 2. And in the lower right-hand corner, you can see that sign that needed to be placed with the plant when they were in the nursery, which says plant with caution, which we often smile at and say, how do you plant an invasive plant with caution? So it seems an impossible task, but that is what the plant said. And it was not well understood by the public, and these plants continued to be sold. In fact, 3 of these species, Japanese barberry, burning bush, and nandina, are very big money makers for the nursery trade. And when we went through the law process, these were species that the nurseries really stressed that they needed to continue to sell. So at the same time that Maryland is working on establishing and getting species onto its prohibited list, other states in the Mid-Atlantic, Northeast, and New England were also doing the same. The top line there shows the year that invasive species legislation was passed in that state. With 2 states, Pennsylvania and Virginia, are blank, but they regulate under their noxious weed law. And I mentioned New Jersey that has a pending law, so we're hoping they join the group of states with an invasive species law. If you look at the bottom line here, Maryland has a combined 14 prohibited non-native invasive or noxious weeds. And our number is a lot lower than most of these other states. So as we were coming into that 2024 legislation session, we thought there is work to be done here.
With this as background, we said, well, how are we going to fix this? We'd just come off the success of getting the native plant bill passed, and Kirsten and our other very active member, Marie Laporte from the Sierra Club, and I were sitting down and saying, well, what are we going to focus on for 2024? And there I was grumbling about our handling of invasive plants. I just thought that it was incredible that there had been no staff allocated to do assessments. And as a result, no plants had been assessed since 2019. There were still, since 2019, only 6 prohibited plants. Kirsten has already mentioned that we felt that another issue was the tier 2 plants that just required the signage, that was not an effective way to handle things. And the risk assessment protocol was incredibly challenging, academic. Someone described it as like writing a master's thesis to do an assessment on one plant. It was very time consuming, and it could easily take, if you're working on a job and you have other priorities also pulling on you, and this is your main priority, but it could still take 7 to 8 weeks per plant. So there was the tier, the staffing, and the protocol, and we said, let's do something about this. So, first of all, Before we looked at the decided on what should go in the 2024 law, we also looked back at what didn't work in the previous attempt to fix the 2011 law. The law in 2022 that Kirsten referred to, and also included that little bit about planting natives. People thought that, oh, let's just tell them about the names of more invasives and it will help solve the problem. So they took the plant invaders of mid-Atlantic natural areas, and the sponsor said, let's just say that these plants have to be assessed. There were 61 invasive plants and 19 watch plants in there. And that certainly would have added to the 6 that were prohibited and the 13 that required the signage. So they did say, as part of this law, that they needed to add 3 people to the area in the Maryland Department of Ag that was responsible for this, 2 assessors and 1 nursery inspector. But guess what? They got none of these positions. Given the problems that were unresolved with the 2011 legislation and the lack of progress with the 2022 law, we decided to see whether we could get additional staff and we could address the issues with the extremely time-consuming protocol. The tier system, we wanted to get rid of that, and we wanted to deal with the fact that the scope was limited to commercial plants that were terrestrial. And we felt this was, at this point, an incredible crisis because over decades, each decade, the environmental and economic harm was accelerating. It wasn't linear. This was rapidly heading a curve that was heading up more rapidly and becoming more of a problem. So, surprise, we addressed the assessment protocol. We allowed for an easier protocol that was a status protocol to be used so that well-established invasive plants, plants that were incredibly widespread, like for instance English ivy, could be banned from sale, which under the previous protocol they couldn't be. Also, plants that have been around for 50 or more years, those could be banned. In other words, we were getting rid of the tier 2 plants that just required signage and saying, if a plant is assessed as invasive, why not just forbid it from being sold? The assessment protocol, besides being simpler, also allowed for qualified assessors who are not part of IPAC or the Department of Ag. And if there still was an EDRR species, those early detection rapid response species where you need to address them right away and maybe you can head them off from becoming established, for that, there still is a need for a risk protocol, but we have many more plants that are already here in Maryland, and the status protocol would work for those. We also broadened the scope to include aquatic and non-commercial plants. The aquatic was something that the Maryland DNR in particular was interested in. And as we mentioned, we really needed to have positions in the MDA budget, which, as you know from listening to the news, both last year and this year has been a real problem. The bill passed, and now we're on the implementation phase. The program coordinator was hired within MDA, who's dedicated to implementing this law. Apparently, the regulations have been revised and submitted, but the word is that they are going to be posted for comment in May. The legislation, by its very nature, is more of an outline, and the regulations serve to define how the legislation is going to be implemented. So the regulations can be just as important as the law, or even more important. The regulations, there's some indication that the phase-out period for invasives may be increased. And if that's the case, we need to try and see what we can to keep that from happening. And IPAC, the Invasive Plant Advisory Council, is currently looking over the structure of the status assessment that we put together before the new bill was written, and is fine-tuning it and finalizing it. And here I'm going to put in a word that Kirsten Hoffman was suggested for IPAC and is now on that important committee, serving a vital role there, along with the native plant person at the extension, Lisa Cooter. So there were already plenty of allies on IPAC, but now we have two additional very important ones. Kirsten has attended all of the one monthly meeting, but she's looking forward to having a say in how this law gets implemented in the future. So again, I mentioned that the regulations are going to be coming out in May. Please watch for those. They are really crucial in terms of how successful this new law is. So I was asked when we were putting together this presentation to briefly touch on cultivars and hybrids. Cultivars and hybrids, historically, since 2011, have not been allowed. They've been grouped with the actual assessment of a species unless there is evidence provided that the cultivar or hybrid is not going to be invasive. And if that occurs, there will be an exception. There can be an exception. And in fact, in all the years since 2011, only one cultivar or hybrid has, I think it was just a cultivar, has been given an exception. In particular, a cultivar could be considered not to be invasive if it is sterile. But even the so-called sterile cultivars are usually not really sterile. It might be, for instance, instead of a plant having 1,000 seeds, it might have 10 seeds on it that are viable. But if you've got 10 seeds On an invasive plant, you can still have other plants grow from that, and chances are the other plants that grow from that are going to have all their seeds, or at least more seeds, being viable, and you've started another problem with that invasive. An example is this top picture here, which is Calorie pear. And the cultivar Bradford pear was developed years ago, and everyone said this is a sterile calorie pear. But all that was needed was for the Bradford pear to have a good date. And then it could produce fertile fruit. So when additional cultivars were developed, they did cross-pollinate. Bradford pear was self-sterile. It couldn't fertilize itself, but the new cultivars could. So that's an example of why when there are cultivars or hybrids, they need to really have proof that they are going to be sterile. I was also asked to touch on hybrids. I've mentioned that previously, but that is also an issue with invasive plants. There are often naturally occurring hybrids of invasives that are just as invasive or more invasive. I gave the example of the white mulberry hybridizing with the native red mulberry. There also is a situation with Japanese knotweed hybridizing with giant knotweed, and it produces a named hybrid, naturally produces one called Bohemian knotweed. Often these hybrids have what's called hybrid vigor, so they could actually be more invasive than the straight species invasive.
So I know we are past 8 o'clock, so I will keep these slides really brief. I just wanted to share this with you, just so you know some other things we are working on that are not at the state level. These would be county level efforts. The first one being, I think something that was really important that we just finished about a month ago, working on the Baltimore County Landscape Manual. For those who aren't familiar, most of our counties will have a landscape manual, and it will put forth landscape requirements for basically any commercial project. So anything that you see in the built environment, with the exception of single family homes, will be the only thing that would not be regulated under a county landscape manual. Baltimore County's manual hadn't been updated since 2020. So we were heading 25 years without an update, and it really had very little recognition of the value of native plants in our landscape. So we put together, and our coalition came together to work on this, and we got some really good advancements in the manual. You can see we now have a minimum requirement for the use of native plants on any commercial project, and it is by plant type. We got a nice number for trees, since trees are what is predominantly stressed on commercial projects. Much lower numbers for evergreens and shrubs, but those are something for the next iteration of changes that we hope that we can raise those numbers. We also got much stronger language about invasive plants. It was relatively weak before, but the language in the manual now says if a plant is listed by the Maryland Invasive Species Council as invasive, that commercial projects in the county cannot use that plant. Third, we really wanted to see some biodiversity among tree species in the manual. I had just looked at a project where there were 60 tree species, or 60 trees specified, and 50 of those trees were the same species, which is I see a dangerous practice. I think if something happened to that species, they would have lost all the trees on that project potentially. So we, if the chart we came up with, if a project had more than 10 trees, we were going to require some diversity of the species specified. Again, I think a good practice that was supported by the landscape architects that were part of the committee. And finally, we were really worried about tree survival, especially in parking lots and in urban areas. we saw practices a lot of times in parking lots. A tree would last 3 to 4 years, then it would die, and then they would put another small tree. So those trees were never surviving long enough to really provide ecosystem benefits. So we got at least a recommendation to hopefully start changing design practices where trees, instead of a set size, would be based on soil volume requirements. And we took these recommendations from Casey Trees, and I think that it's going to be a successful thing in the future. And so hopefully we'll start seeing trees survive much longer when they have more soil volume in which to grow. A lot of our ideas in this were based on some things that Prince George's County had in their manual. So I really appreciate the work they had done, and keep your eye out for Howard County. Their manual is currently being revised. So if there's anybody that lives in Howard County, that was certainly something to watch and see if there's any public input, so you can get some stress on native plants in that manual as well. The other project that is kind of a long-term ongoing is working on county weed ordinances. I know this is something that Wild Ones has put out a managed natural landscape ordinance that I've seen various places around the country that have based an ordinance on. We brought forth some language in Baltimore County. Baltimore City has had an ordinance proposed. Prince George's County and Laurel. We haven't gotten that far in any of these, but we have been certainly working on developing language. There is a demand to finally have a recognition of managed natural landscape or low impact landscaping. It comes by many names in the weed ordinances as an exception, so that people that are putting native plants, especially in their front yards, can relax and not think their neighbors are going to complain that their plants are too tall and get cited by the counties. So I mentioned there, Brentwood, Hyattsville, and Bowie do have exception language in their weed ordinances. So we were trying to use a lot of Hyattsville language for the county, but the one big issue we run into is the weed inspectors. I shouldn't call them that. They are inspectors. They inspect many, many things. Weeds, tall weeds are one thing they inspect. They're not plant people. And our county, Baltimore County, did not feel comfortable asking them to differentiate tall weeds versus native plants. So we've been working on ways to help in that process and make it an easier process so that the inspectors would feel comfortable identifying what was going on a property and not citing a homeowner who actually had native plants in their landscape.
So what happened this year in legislation was interesting. After two very successful years, 2023 and 2024, the Maryland General Assembly was incredibly preoccupied with the budget situation. There were very few bills that managed to advance and then get passed that were environmentally focused. And even some bills that did have environmental focus, like a PFAS bill, Forever Chemicals, and a power line right-of-way bill in wildlands, we found that we were really on the defensive. As an example, the Forever Chemical bill was proposed by a very strong coalition of advocates, and it was an excellent bill. And it went into a subcommittee in the committee where it was proposed, and proceeded to be hijacked by the chemical industry, who managed to change it in such a way that it actually didn't help get Forever Chemicals regulated. It would interfere with getting them regulated by eliminating most chemicals that were covered. Not only would that have been a problem for Maryland, but it would have also set a precedent for other legislation, both at the federal and at the state level throughout the country. What was interesting is that after writing this excellent bill and trying to get it passed, with the amendments, the coalition came out against the bill and convinced the General Assembly, specifically the Senate, it was in the Senate, not to advance the bill. So the moral of the story is there's always something that's going on, and you need to keep your eyes on the ball and also check for things. The native plant person in the extension, the very small funding that was allocated for her was put into the budget bill to be eliminated. And we found out about this in the 11th hour and just managed to save it. And if we hadn't found out about it, we would have lost this incredibly valuable and crucial person in the extension. So keep on watching, see what bills are good, and then don't assume everything is fine. Look for the bills that you want to oppose. As this says, the work is never done. Stay involved, stay informed, and be ready to advocate. And specifically, let's keep an eye out for the regs and what they are. Neither Kirsten nor I have seen them, but keep an eye out for them. They will be published in the Maryland Register, and I believe we had the link that was, I believe it was put into the chat. Kirsten, would you like to add to that?
I will just say that Judy and I are obviously going to be watching for each version of the register for those regulations, and when they do come out, we will be sure to communicate with all of our groups and with Wild Ones and kind of explain what the change has been, and if we need some people to write letters, we will certainly reach out to you and let you know, because we need your help. I know Wild Ones members have provided invaluable help in the past on our legislation that we've worked on, and so we've so appreciated that, and that we hope we can count on you in the future.
Well, we've taken a long time here, but I guess I'd ask Marlene whether there are questions in the chat or whether people would like to ask their questions now.
So I think folks did a good job of answering the questions as they came up in the chat. There was one question about the link to the registry. I don't believe that was entered in the chat, and I don't know that I have that link. If someone could provide that, that would be greatly appreciated.
Do you have that, Kirsten?
I will. Let me, give me just a second and I will get that into the chat.
No problem. No, but I can definitely tell the passion that you both have for native plants and invasive plants, and I thank you for sharing your information. I know a lot of us learned a lot tonight. I did, and I saw some people making comments that they had. I did have a couple of questions, one of which was answered as I poked around. I was questioning whether or not the spreadsheet for the Maryland commercial plants had a list of the excluded species and why. And I did find that that's a separate tab on the commercial plant list. I apologize if you mentioned that and I missed it, but I did want to make sure folks did know that those excluded plants had a separate tab on the spreadsheet.
And we're continually adding to that list as the nurseries apply to be certified. They may include species that either we want to add to the commercial list because they aren't there yet, or they might have species that it makes sense excluding. So that is a tab that continues to grow.
Thank you. I know that that's a living document, and we appreciate all the work that you're putting into it. I did have one other question. Are you familiar with the sociability ratings promoted by Benjamin Vogt? I was just curious. I know I've listened to webinars by Benjamin Vogt, and he talks about sociability of native plants and how they play well or don't play well with one another in the gardens. And I was just wondering if that had some relativity to that C value that you mentioned.
I think it does relate to that, but I think that it's worthwhile. I had heard of these sociability values, and I think it makes sense for us to look into that further. Wouldn't you say, Kirsten?
Yeah, but I mean, pretty much whenever we get suggestions about, here's information that would be nice to have as part of the commercial list, we are happy to look into it and see if we can, add that information in some form. So certainly we can take a look.
Thank you. So we will be posting the recording of the presentation on our Wildlands Chesapeake Bay YouTube channel.
And Jimmy, it looks like you have a question.
Well, I'll admit it's less a question and more a testimonial, but to say that I think, as y'all know, was like, this is great that you want to have this list of plants for nurseries, but this is going to be unbelievably useful to gardeners and folks like myself. And I can attest that since that list came out, I literally use it every single day. I'm really glad that it's also a living document and will continue to get better over time. So I really appreciate that.
Well, first of all, I'd like to give a shout out for Jimmy because he was a crucial member of the team, helping with social media and getting the word out with the invasive plant bill. So thank you, Jimmy. And I also want to emphasize that the spreadsheet that we have there, as Kirsten said, it's the beginning, and we are going to have more user-friendly versions of that we're currently working on that will make it easier to do things like filter on the fly.
I don't see any hands or any more questions in the chat. I want to thank everybody for attending tonight, especially thank Kirsten and Judy for their expertise and the lovely presentation that they gave. It was an exceptional evening, I think. It was a great way to celebrate Earth Day.
All right. Well, thank you all. We appreciate you having us and
It's
forward to working with some of you in the
nice.
future.
Yes.
And we have lots of nice thank yous and great work in the chat. So.
All right. Well, thank you for being such a good audience.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.
All right. Good night.